4:15 in the morning, the coast of the United Arab Emirates. The early warning network that should have been pinging with constant maritime traffic data was completely silent. Captain James Miller at Al Dhafra Air Base had been staring at that blank screen for 20 minutes. A heavy atmospheric dust inversion layer had settled over the northern approach to the Strait of Hormuz, pressing the heat down and scattering the radar returns. The air outside the Tactical Operations Center tasted like chalk, the wind completely dead against the reinforced concrete bunkers. Al Dhafra housed 3,000 American personnel, a wing of FA-18 fighters, and a battery of Patriot surface-to-air missiles. Inside the command center, the hum of the cooling servers was the only sound. The massive screens covering the front wall displayed the geographical expanse of the Persian Gulf and the crucial choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. Usually, the dark room was a chaotic overlap of friendly transponder signals, commercial shipping tracks, and Allied maritime patrol routes. Tonight, the upper atmospheric dust inversion layer had blanketed everything. The severe weather phenomenon trapped surface heat close to the water, creating a thermal mirror that blinded the space-based infrared sensors. Worse, the heavy particulate matter suspended in the air was actively absorbing high-frequency radar pulses, creating massive blind spots across the northern sector. The Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment, issued 12 hours prior, had assessed the Iranian coastal launch complexes in the southern sector as completely dormant and stripped of munitions. Based entirely on that document, the defensive readiness condition of the airbase had been formally lowered. The Patriot missile batteries were operating on standby power to conserve generator fuel. The interceptor aircraft were resting on the tarmac with heavy canvas covers secured over their engine intakes. Captain Miller walked slowly across the elevated floor of the control room. He stopped behind a junior lieutenant who was strictly monitoring the regional air traffic control feed. The lieutenant tapped his glass screen with a pen. The commercial aviation corridor heading into Dubai was running normally, but the military bands facing north toward the Iranian coast were totally dark. No electronic intelligence gatherers were broadcasting. No maritime patrol aircraft were pushing the boundary line. Just a vast, static-filled void extending 150 miles across the Blackwater. The silence felt unnervingly heavy. The dust inversion was a known regional weather pattern, something that occurred 2 or 3 times a summer, but it rarely caused a total blackout of the early warning network. Miller picked up a secure telephone handset and dialed the regional air defense commander at Al Udeid Air Base. The encrypted line clicked, hissed, and connected with a metallic echo. Miller reported the severe degradation in sensor fidelity across his designated sector. The regional commander acknowledged the verbal report, but explicitly declined to alter the alert status. The pre-mission intelligence brief was still the governing tactical document. The threat from the northern coastline was officially categorized as negligible. Outside on the sprawling flight line, the maintenance crews were finishing their grueling overnight shift. Airman First Class Thomas Harris was walking the outer perimeter fence near the northern munitions bunker. The ambient heat was oppressive, hovering at 38 degrees Celsius even in the absolute dead of night. Harris carried his rifle slung over his shoulder, shining a heavy flashlight into the swirling dust. The harsh white beam cut off after 20 meters, swallowed completely by the thick airborne particulate. The signature atmospheric inversion layer made standard thermal imaging goggles nearly useless for the security teams. When Harris raised his night vision optic to his eye, the digital screen showed only a uniform, glowing green fog. The surface temperature of the air and the physical temperature of the desert ground were exactly the same. There was absolutely no thermal contrast. There was nothing to see but the dust. Back in the heavily fortified command center, the very first anomaly finally registered. It was not a long-range radar track. It was not a satellite thermal bloom. A secure data link from an Allied naval vessel patrolling the shallow waters of the Strait of Hormuz fed a sudden acoustic spike into the tactical network. Captain Miller watched the single orange data point blink onto the main tracking screen. It was tentatively classified as an unknown surface contact, moving at a speed of 45 knots. That high speed was physically consistent with a fast attack craft, but the geographical location was completely wrong. The solitary contact was inside the shallow water of the littoral zone, moving parallel to the rocky coastline, rather than crossing the open shipping channel. Miller leaned over the main sensor console. He ordered the radar operators to focus all available scanning power directly on that specific grid coordinate. The phased array radar systems of the Patriot battery outside shifted their search sectors, pouring electromagnetic energy into the thick dust layer. The resulting returns were messy, heavily fractured by the severe atmospheric conditions. The base computer algorithms struggled to build a coherent tracking picture. For 3 agonizing minutes, the center of the dark room was entirely focused on that single, strange contact on the board. Then, the main display screen blinked again. A second, distinct contact appeared immediately behind the first. Then, a third contact registered. They were not floating on the water. They were airborne, flying at a dangerously low altitude of barely 100 meters, completely hidden from the long-range scanners until they breached the inner surveillance ring. The long silence in the Tactical Operations Center finally broke. The Defense Support Program satellites orbiting 22,000 miles above the Earth registered the first thermal bloom at exactly 4:17 in the morning. The launch occurred from a known coastal military facility near Bandar Abbas. Under normal weather conditions, the space-based infrared sensors would have caught the heat flash the millisecond the solid rocket booster ignited. Tonight, the severe atmospheric dust inversion layer absorbed the initial blast energy, holding the intense heat down against the desert floor. By the time the exhaust plume burned high enough to breach the top of the suspended particulate, the primary missile was already in its second stage of flight. A secondary thermal bloom appeared 3 seconds later, then a third. The early warning data link flashed the raw telemetry directly to the United States Central Command Regional Network. Deep inside the Tactical Operations Center at Al Dhafra Air Base, the automated warning klaxon began a rhythmic, deafening howl. Captain James Miller gripped the edge of the master control console. He watched the main threat display rewrite itself. The isolated, low-altitude drone contacts in the littoral zone were suddenly overshadowed by 3 heavy ballistic arcs painting across the digital map. The weapons were climbing fast, pushing toward the edge of the stratosphere. The command post immediately ordered Condition Red. Over the base public address system, a synthesized voice directed all 3,000 personnel to seek immediate cover in the reinforced concrete bunkers. The Central Command intelligence brief from 12 hours ago, which had explicitly labeled the northern coastline as completely dormant, was officially dead. The adversary had fully operational munitions, and they were already in the air. Out on the sprawling flight line, the transition to battle stations was a violently fast process. Airman First Class Thomas Harris abandoned his perimeter patrol route the second the klaxon triggered. He slung his rifle tightly across his chest and sprinted through the swirling dust toward Bunker Charlie 4. The 38-degree ambient heat made his heavy ballistic vest feel like a furnace. The air around him was no longer just hot and dusty. It was vibrating. The low-frequency rumble of the base defensive systems powering up shook the concrete under his heavy boots. The Patriot missile batteries positioned on the northern defensive berm required precisely 3 minutes to shift from their generator conservation mode into full operational readiness. The massive diesel engines roared to life, pushing thick black exhaust into the stagnant air as they fed peak electrical current into the AN/SPY-6 radar arrays. The heavy, block-shaped radar faces physically elevated, aiming their concentrated electromagnetic energy high into the black sky. The phased array systems immediately struggled against the signature weather phenomenon. The heavy suspended dust particles scattered the high-frequency radar pulses, creating thousands of false returns. The base computer algorithms worked aggressively to filter out the atmospheric noise and establish solid track files on the incoming ballistic targets. The digital tracks flickered, dropping off the master screen for 3 seconds at a time, before reappearing several miles closer to the coast. Miller stood directly behind the regional air traffic control lieutenant, projecting his voice over the noise of the cooling fans and the alarms. He ordered an immediate scramble for the alert fighter interceptors. 2 FA-18 fighters, resting silently under canvas covers just moments ago, were already spooling their twin turbofan engines. The ground maintenance crews worked frantically in the dark, tearing the intake covers away and pulling the heavy red safety pins from the AIM-120 missiles mounted on the wings. The pilots were already strapped into their ejection seats, rushing through the abbreviated emergency flight checklist. The control tower suspended all local flight rules and cleared the alert fighters for an immediate, unrestricted climb into the combat zone. The two interceptors rolled forward out of their hardened shelters, their afterburners igniting with a concussive roar that shattered the heavy stillness of the desert night. 4:22 in the morning. Inside the heavily fortified command center at Al Dhafra, the main tactical display began to resolve the fractured radar data into definitive flight paths. The three ballistic contacts had breached the stratosphere, reaching an altitude of 80,000 meters. The base computer algorithms finally burned through the heavy electromagnetic clutter caused by the atmospheric dust inversion layer, establishing solid, unbroken telemetry on the incoming weapons. The Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment had explicitly categorized the southern Iranian launch complexes as dormant, and established regional defense models dictated that any residual rogue fire would naturally target the high-value carrier strike groups operating in the deep water. Captain James Miller stood perfectly still as the digital projection lines extended across the master screen. The three ballistic arcs did not terminate in the Persian Gulf. They completely bypassed the commercial shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz. The red lines curved violently downward, crossing the United Arab Emirates shoreline, and locked directly onto the exact geographical coordinates of the airbase. They were medium-range ballistic missiles, and their time to impact was precisely 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The intelligence failure compounded a second time. The three low-altitude drone contacts, originally detected loitering in the littoral shallows, abruptly changed their heading. They abandoned their holding patterns near the coastline and accelerated to 150 knots, turning due south. The tactical action officers immediately recognized the synchronization. The drones had been launched hours earlier, flying mere meters above the water to evade the already severely degraded radar network. They were timed to cross the base perimeter at the exact moment the heavy ballistic weapons arrived from the upper atmosphere, forcing the base defensive systems to split their processing power between two completely different altitudes. Outside in the suffocating heat, the Patriot missile batteries locked their heavy radar faces onto the descending ballistic targets. The AN/SPY-6 phased arrays were pushing maximum kilowatt output, driving massive amounts of electrical energy directly into the suspended particulate matter. The cooling systems roared like jet engines, struggling to keep the hardware from melting down in the 38-degree ambient temperature. Inside the engagement control station, a heavily armored vehicle parked behind the earthen berms, the fire control officers authorized the intercept geometry. The system shifted into semi-autonomous mode, prioritizing the three hypersonic threats dropping from the black sky. 10,000 meters above the desert floor, the two FA-18 fighters tore through the night. Captain Sarah Jenkins, flying the lead aircraft, pushed her twin throttles into full military power. The canopy glass surrounding her was completely black. There were no stars visible. There was no horizon line separating the Earth from the sky. The severe dust inversion layer had swallowed her fighter entirely, wrapping the aircraft in a heavy, abrasive shroud that hissed violently against the fuselage. Jenkins relied entirely on her digital instruments. Her APG-79 radar was struggling to paint a clear picture of the airspace below her. The heavy dust particles trapped near the surface were acting like a thermal and electromagnetic mirror, bouncing her radar pulses back as a massive wall of white static on her primary display. She was attempting to locate three small, composite hull attack drones skimming the desert floor, but the weather phenomenon rendered her onboard sensors nearly blind. The fighter interceptors were forced to rely on the secure data link transmitting from the Tactical Operations Center below. The digital cues flickered onto Jenkins's helmet visor, providing rough geographical coordinates for the low-flying drones. She pulled her control stick hard to the left, banking the FA-18 into a steep dive toward the deck. The physical strain of the tight turn pressed her heavily into her ejection seat. Back in the command center, Miller watched the intercept geometry forming on the lower half of the main screen. The Patriot batteries were entirely consumed with the high-altitude ballistic tracks, leaving the low-level defense entirely to the two fighter jets and the base security forces on the perimeter. The distance between the incoming drones and the outer fence line was collapsing rapidly. The contacts were 18 miles out, The silence that had previously defined the room was completely gone, replaced by the relentless, overlapping audio warnings of the threat tracking systems. The airspace over the United Arab Emirates, supposedly secure and dormant just 30 minutes ago, was now saturated with incoming fire from two different vectors. 4:24 in the morning, at an altitude of 500 meters, the severe atmospheric dust inversion layer felt less like weather and more like flying through a liquid wall. Captain Sarah Jenkins fought the control stick of her FA-18 fighter. The turbulent, superheated air currents violently shook the heavy aircraft as she pushed the twin throttles forward. She was flying entirely on digital instruments. The canopy glass surrounding her cockpit was an impenetrable sheet of static black, bombarded continuously by heavy suspended sand particles that hissed aggressively against the fuselage. The tactical data link projected directly onto her helmet visor provided the only spatial awareness she had. The digital display showed 3 hostile drone contacts 12 miles ahead, flying in a loose wedge formation at a speed of 150 knots. Jenkins armed the AIM-9 X-ray infrared missiles mounted on her wingtips. She flipped the master arm switch, waiting for the high-pitched tone in her headset that would indicate a successful thermal lock. She heard only a broken, staticky growl. The ambient temperature of the desert floor was 38 degrees Celsius. The composite hull of the Iranian attack drone was likely radiating at barely 40 degrees. The signature weather phenomenon was trapping all that surface heat in a tight band, equalizing the temperature of the entire airspace. The highly advanced missile seekers were completely blinded by the thermal mirror, unable to distinguish the drone exhaust from the glowing hot sand directly beneath it. "I have no thermal contrast on the lead element," Jenkins transmitted over the secure interflight radio. Switching to guns. "I am engaging the lead contact blind, using data link vectors only." Her wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Vance, flying in the second FA-18 fighter, acknowledged the order and broke formation to the right. He began a sweeping turn to line up on the secondary target. Jenkins pushed the nose of her aircraft down, dropping to a dangerously low altitude of 200 meters. She ignored the automated voice and kept her eyes locked on the projected target box floating in her visor. She squeezed the trigger on her flight stick. The M61 20mm rotary cannon mounted in the nose of the fighter spooled up with a heavy mechanical vibration. A stream of high-explosive incendiary rounds tore through the heavy dust layer, cutting a bright orange path through the dark sky. Jenkins walked the stream of fire directly through the center of the projected data link box. A sudden, bright flash illuminated the dust cloud 3 miles ahead of her. The 20mm rounds had shredded the composite wing of the lead drone, detonating its internal fuel cell. Jenkins pulled back hard on the control stick, pulling 5 Gs of physical force as she pitched the fighter violently upward to avoid the expanding debris field. To her right, Lieutenant Vance attempted the same maneuver. He pushed his fighter into a steep dive, aiming his rotary cannon at the second digital contact. Before he could squeeze the trigger, the contact on the data link suddenly shifted. The second and third drones executed a hard, synchronized defensive break. They dropped their altitude to barely 30 meters above the desert floor, diving directly into a deep, dry riverbed known as a wadi. The rocky walls of the narrow canyon immediately masked their flight paths. The Allied naval vessel, patrolling the shallow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, which had been providing the critical acoustic and radar tracking data, completely lost the connection. The digital target boxes on Vance's helmet visor vanished. Inside the Tactical Operations Center at Al Dhafra Air Base, the sudden disappearance of the 2 drone contacts sent a shockwave of urgency through the room. Captain James Miller leaned heavily over the master tracking console. The Central Command intelligence briefs had completely failed to account for this level of automated terrain masking capability in the adversary's drone fleet. The weapons were not blindly flying a compass heading. They were actively utilizing the topographical features of the United Arab Emirates to shield themselves from the remaining sensors. "We have lost track on the 2 surviving surface contacts," the radar operator reported loudly, his voice cutting through the wail of the alarms. "They are inside the 10-mile perimeter. We have no visual and no telemetry." Miller did not have time to reassign the fighter interceptors to search the riverbed. The main display screen flashed a brilliant crimson warning. The primary threat was arriving. The three medium-range ballistic missiles had reached the apex of their atmospheric arcs and were now initiating their terminal descent. They were dropping at a speed of Mach 5, plunging straight down into the heavy dust inversion layer directly above the base. The Patriot missile batteries on the northern berm were the only defensive systems standing between the warheads and the concrete bunkers housing 3,000 personnel. 4:26 in the morning. The Tactical Operations Center at Al Dhafra Air Base was operating at maximum processing capacity. The primary threat display was completely dominated by the three hypersonic tracks plunging straight down from the edge of space. The weapons had crossed the 80,000-meter threshold, accelerating under the pull of gravity and their own terminal guidance systems. Captain James Miller stood rigidly behind the main sensor console, watching the altitude numbers spool downward with terrifying speed. The Central Command Intelligence Assessment had completely missed this coordinated capability. The adversary had managed to launch a synchronized, multi-axis strike using both advanced terrain masking drones and heavy ballistic weapons, timing them to arrive at the exact same moment. The base defenses were being stretched to their absolute physical limits. Outside on the northern defensive berm, the Patriot missile batteries were fighting the signature weather phenomenon. The severe atmospheric dust inversion layer trapped dense pockets of hot sand close to the ground, actively scattering the high-frequency radar pulses. To maintain a solid lock on the incoming warheads, the AN/SPY-6 radar arrays were pushing maximum electrical output, driving massive amounts of energy directly into the airborne particulate. The heavy diesel generators screamed under the load, vibrating the reinforced concrete pads they rested on. The thick dust made the air hard to breathe and impossible to see through. Inside the heavily armored engagement control station parked just behind the earthen berms, the fire control officers watched their digital track files flicker and jump. The computer algorithms were working aggressively to separate the true radar returns of the warheads from the massive wall of environmental static. The automated system calculated the precise intercept geometry, determining that the three descending weapons were aimed directly at the central munitions storage bunkers and the primary command center. The time to impact was precisely 12 seconds. The human operators authorized the weapon's release, transferring full authority to the autonomous firing computer. The Patriot missile launch canisters on the northern berm erupted in a blinding sequence of rapid fire, violently shaking the heavily armored engagement control station and throwing the tactical operators back into their seats against their heavy restraint harnesses. The automated defensive system had seized control because three medium-range ballistic warheads, launched from the supposedly dormant Iranian coast, had just penetrated the heavy dust inversion layer directly above the base. The incoming weapons were traveling at Mach 5, burning with the sharp chemical bite of scorched ozone and friction heat, when they collided perfectly with the ascending interceptors. The sheer kinetic force of the high-altitude impact shredded the hypersonic warheads into thousands of jagged titanium fragments, blasting heavy pieces of scorched metal downward to crush the perimeter security fences and punch deep, smoking craters directly into the concrete flight line. The sky directly above the installation glowed an unnatural, bruised purple for 5 agonizing seconds, illuminated entirely by the suspended dust reflecting the massive kinetic blasts. Inside the command center, the acoustic shockwave hit the reinforced concrete walls a full 10 seconds after the flash. The heavy bunkers shuddered. Dust and loose debris fell from the ceiling fixtures, coating the computer consoles in a fine, gritty powder. Captain Miller gripped the edge of his desk, his eyes fixed firmly on the master display screen. "Confirm, intercept," Miller ordered, his voice steady despite the physical shaking of the room. The radar operator wiped a layer of dust from his monitor. Intercept confirmed on all 3 high-altitude tracks. The ballistic threats are destroyed. We have multiple debris impacts on the northern perimeter and the secondary flight line, but the primary warheads did not detonate. The Patriot system had successfully defended the base from the heavy weapons, expending $12 million of interceptor missiles in under 8 seconds. But the tactical situation was far from secure. The kinetic destruction of 3 large ballistic missiles at an altitude of 12,000 meters did not vaporize the threat. It turned the weapons into a massive shower of high-velocity shrapnel. More critically, the falling debris compounded the existing environmental problems. The The severe dust inversion layer was already blinding the thermal sensors. Now, thousands of pieces of hot, jagged titanium were falling through the airspace, creating a massive curtain of electromagnetic clutter. The base radar screens became a chaotic mess of false contacts, ghost tracks, and blooming static. The AN/SPY-6 phased arrays were completely overloaded by the descending metal rain. Miller looked at the lower quadrant of his tactical map. The brief relief of surviving the ballistic strike evaporated instantly. "Status on the 2 low-altitude drone contacts," Miller demanded, turning toward the regional air traffic control lieutenant, the ones that dropped into the dry riverbed. The lieutenant shook his head, frantically typing commands into his console. "Negative contact, sir. The debris cloud from the ballistic intercept is completely jamming our lower radar bands. We cannot see through the falling metal. The drones are still unaccounted for." The synchronized attack was achieving its true purpose. The heavy ballistic missiles had forced the base to reveal its primary radar locations and saturate the airspace with blinding debris. Hidden somewhere inside that chaotic, heavily degraded electronic environment, 2 low-flying attack drones were still running completely silent, masked by the riverbed and shielded by the weather. They were inside the 10-mile ring, and the base was completely blind. 4:28 in the morning. The Tactical Operations Center at Al Dhafra Air Base was drowning in a flood of fractured data. The violent destruction of the 3 hypersonic ballistic missiles had saved the central command bunkers from complete vaporization, but the successful intercept had catastrophically degraded the local electronic environment. The master display screens were a blinding snowstorm of false returns and ghost tracks. Captain James Miller stood perfectly still as the chaos unfolded around him. The severe atmospheric dust inversion layer, combined with thousands of pieces of jagged titanium shrapnel falling through the airspace, had created an impenetrable electromagnetic shield directly over the installation. The radar operators were frantically attempting to recalibrate the AN/SPY-6 phased arrays, desperately trying to filter out the falling metal, so they could find the 2 low-altitude drone contacts that had vanished into the dry riverbed. The base computer algorithms simply could not process the overwhelming volume of environmental clutter. The installation was essentially blind. Near the southern perimeter fence, Airman First Class Thomas Harris was crouched behind the reinforced concrete blast wall of Bunker Charlie 4. The heavy air was thick with the smell of scorched ozone and pulverized desert rock. Sizzling pieces of high-velocity debris from the ballistic intercept were still raining down on the tarmac, striking the concrete with sharp, metallic cracks. The ambient 38-degree heat made breathing through his protective mask a heavy, exhausting labor. Harris heard the new threat long before he could see it. It was a high-pitched, relentless mechanical whine cutting directly through the low rumble of the base diesel generators. It sounded exactly like a heavily modified, overpowered lawnmower engine, entirely distinct from the smooth roar of military turbofans. The sound was echoing up from the deep wadi just outside the wire, moving incredibly fast. The 20mm close-in weapon system mounted on the southern perimeter wall spun up to its maximum firing rate of 4,500 rounds per minute, before anyone in the Tactical Operations Center even knew the fence line had been breached. The autonomous defensive gun was tracking a composite hull attack drone that had just popped violently up from the edge of the riverbed, flying a mere 20 meters above the sand and using the falling ballistic debris as a thermal mask. The automated gun fired a solid, deafening stream of high-explosive incendiary rounds that chewed directly through the drone's left wing, completely severing the aerodynamic control surfaces in a shower of sparks. However, the sheer kinetic momentum of the 150-knot approach carried the tumbling, burning fuselage straight into the base's primary southern surveillance and communications array. The 50-kilogram high-explosive payload detonated on impact, instantly vaporizing the heavy steel support struts and blasting the massive radar dish backward into the adjacent generator block, crushing the concrete housing and the 3 maintenance engineers sheltering inside. The violent blast wave threw Harris brutally against the blast wall, knocking the breath from his lungs. As the sharp chemical bite of burning propellant washed entirely over the perimeter line, the entire southern sector of the airbase immediately lost primary power. The heavy security floodlights flickered and died, plunging the fence line into total darkness. Inside the command center, the lower right quadrant of the master tactical display instantly flatlined to static. The destruction of the surveillance array completely severed the local data link, creating a massive, unmonitored blind spot in the defensive network. "We just lost the southern perimeter array," the regional air traffic control lieutenant shouted over the wailing alarms. "I am showing 0 telemetry from Sector 4. The phased array is completely offline. We have a confirmed hostile detonation inside the wire," the damage control officer reported, his hands flying across his keyboard. "We have massive structural collapse at the southern generator block and multiple confirmed casualties. The fire is spreading rapidly toward the secondary aviation fuel lines." Miller gripped the edge of the master console, his jaw locked tight. The adversary had successfully executed a brilliant, multi-layered deception. They had used highly advanced ballistic missiles to force the base to reveal its heavy radar emitters and saturate the sky with blinding debris. Then, they had used cheap, slow-moving propeller drones to slip beneath the chaos, navigating visually through the heavy dust inversion layer to destroy the very sensors the base relied upon. It was an absolute intelligence failure. The United States military had just suffered catastrophic physical damage to a superior defensive installation. The base siren suddenly changed its pitch, shifting from the long, steady wail of an incoming air threat to the sharp, pulsing shriek of an active ground-level breach. There had been 2 drones hiding in the riverbed. The close-in weapon system had sacrificed the perimeter array to destroy the first one. The second drone was already inside the wire, completely unaccounted for, navigating through the heavy black smoke toward the crowded flight line. 4:30 in the morning, the southern perimeter of Al Dhafra Air Base was consumed by a localized inferno. The total destruction of the primary surveillance array had instantly severed the tactical data link for the entire sector, plunging the perimeter wire into operational darkness. The only illumination came from the fierce, violent glow of burning diesel fuel and shredded composite materials, casting long, erratic shadows through the suspended atmospheric dust. Airman First Class Thomas Harris pushed his heavy body off the reinforced concrete blast wall of Bunker Charlie 4. His tactical helmet and ballistic vest were coated in a thick, suffocating layer of pulverized rock. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine from the explosive detonation that had just vaporized the 50-meter radar tower. 30 meters to his right, the shattered remains of the generator block were burning out of control. The intense thermal output was actively warping the heavy steel support struts of the collapsed radar dish, causing the metal to groan audibly over the roar of the flames. 2 base emergency response teams were already rushing toward the flaming rubble, their heavy boots slipping on the scorched concrete. They were dragging high-pressure chemical foam lines through the sand, fighting desperately to suppress the fire, before it could reach the secondary aviation fuel pipes buried just beneath the surface. 4 medics were pulling a severely wounded maintenance engineer from the crushed concrete housing, his uniform saturated with blood and hydraulic fluid. But the primary tactical threat was no longer at the fence line. Inside the heavily fortified command center, the loss of the southern array had generated a massive, unmonitored blind spot that extended directly over the secondary flight line and the central fuel depot. Captain James Miller gripped the edge of his command console, his eyes tracking the dead zone on the master display. The installation computer algorithms were frantically attempting to route tracking data from the surviving northern sensors, but the signature weather phenomenon completely defeated the effort. The severe atmospheric dust inversion layer acted like a dense electromagnetic sponge. The heavy particulate matter suspended just over the tarmac absorbed and scattered the cross-base radar pulses, rendering the high-frequency systems functionally useless at low altitudes. "We have a confirmed hostile drone inside the wire," Miller announced to the room, projecting his voice over the frantic crosstalk of the radar operators. "It is flying strict visual navigation, using the dust layer and the structural fires as cover. It is actively hunting the flight line." The base public address system shifted its tone again, broadcasting the urgent, staccato pulse of a ground-level breach alarm. On the sprawling tarmac outside, the ground maintenance crews who had just launched the 2 alert interceptors abandoned their equipment and ran sprinting for the hardened concrete shelters. The second attack drone had become a purely optical threat. It was navigating completely under the radar floor, shielded from above by the severe dust inversion. and masked from below by the heavy black smoke billowing off the destroyed generator block. 10,000 meters above the installation, Captain Sarah Jenkins circled her FA-18 fighter in a wide holding pattern. She was completely powerless to assist. Her highly advanced APG-79 radar was looking straight down into a chaotic soup of atmospheric static, burning fuel, and thousands of jagged pieces of falling titanium shrapnel from the earlier ballistic intercept. The airspace was an electronic nightmare. She could not see the small composite drone skimming the runway, and firing blindly into the base infrastructure was strictly forbidden. The defense of the flight line fell entirely to the security forces on the ground. Near the central taxiway, a heavily armored security patrol vehicle skidded to a violent halt, its heavy tires burning rubber against the concrete. The gunner mounted in the top turret desperately scanned the airspace with his night vision optics, but the glowing green screen showed only the suffocating thermal mirror of the hot dust. The 38-degree ambient temperature of the desert air perfectly equalized with the exhaust heat of the small drone, rendering thermal tracking completely impossible. Then, the physical sound arrived. The overpowered, high-pitched mechanical whine of the drone engine cut through the heavy air, moving incredibly fast and dangerously low. The dark gray composite hull dropped completely out of the suspended dust layer directly over the secondary runway, banking hard to the left in a tight, aggressive turn. It was locked on to the massive, soft-skinned aviation fuel trucks parked near the central refueling point. Miller watched the ground security deployment on his secondary optical cameras. He immediately bypassed the automated defensive network, knowing the Patriot batteries could never track a target skimming 10 meters above the concrete. All ground elements, weapons free on the visual contact, Miller transmitted over the base-wide tactical frequency. Execute intersecting fire over the secondary runway. Do not let that explosive payload reach the central fuel depot. The base security forces opened fire with everything they possessed. The heavy .50 caliber machine guns mounted on 3 separate patrol vehicles began to pound rhythmically, driving massive streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds straight up into the heavy dust. The bright red tracer rounds cut violently through the thick particulate matter, creating a chaotic, glowing web of lethal defensive fire directly over the central flight line. 4:31 in the morning. The intersecting streams of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds created a solid, glowing wall of kinetic energy directly over the secondary runway. The dark gray composite hull of the Iranian attack drone flew straight into the crossfire at 150 knots. The heavy defensive fire did not merely damage the drone, it fundamentally disassembled the aircraft in mid-air. The massive half-inch bullets shattered the lightweight engine block, instantly severing the fuel lines and sparking the high-explosive payload just 50 meters short of the soft-skinned aviation fuel trucks. The drone detonated with a deafening, concussive crack, producing a massive fireball that bleached the suspended dust white for a fraction of a second. The blast wave threw burning fragments of composite material violently across the concrete taxiway, scorching the surface but leaving the critical fuel reservoirs completely untouched. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the optical cameras mounted on the control tower fed the blinding flash directly to the main display screens. Captain James Miller did not let the room pause to celebrate the narrow survival of the flight line. The installation was still operating blind in the southern sector, and the signature atmospheric dust inversion layer was still pressing a heavy, suffocating blanket of thermal and electromagnetic static down over the base. "Confirm the flight line is secure," Miller ordered, his voice cutting through the ringing alarms. "Get the fire suppression teams out to the secondary runway to douse that wreckage before it ignites the residual fuel vapors. I want a full system reset on the northern radar arrays immediately." The Regional Air Traffic Control Lieutenant typed a rapid sequence of commands into his console. The chaotic snowstorm of false returns and ghost tracks that had plagued the master display for the last 5 minutes finally began to dissipate. The thousands of jagged pieces of titanium shrapnel generated by the violent high-altitude ballistic intercept had finally finished falling through the airspace. The metal rain had hit the desert floor, clearing the massive curtain of electromagnetic clutter that had blinded the primary sensors. The base computer algorithms immediately rebooted, pushing clean electrical power through the ANSPY 6-phased arrays on the northern berm. The radar operators manually filtered out the heavy environmental noise caused by the trapped dust, isolating the true radar returns from the atmospheric static. "We are regaining sector fidelity," the lead radar operator announced, his hands moving flawlessly across the trackball. The high-altitude debris cloud has settled. The data link from the northern array is re-establishing a solid picture of the outer perimeter. The brief moment of relief evaporated 3 seconds later. The moment the long-range sensors pushed their energy back out past the 10-mile ring, the automated warning klaxon triggered a fresh, pulsing alarm. The tactical action officers immediately recognized the lethal brilliance of the adversary's timing. The Central Command Intelligence Assessment had entirely failed to anticipate a multi-stage, staggered strike designed to exploit the base's own defensive cycle. The enemy had used the heavy ballistic missiles to create a blinding debris cloud, sent the low-altitude drones in while the base was blind, and then held one final, heavy weapon back, timing its arrival for the exact moment the defenders believed the engagement was over. A single, heavy land attack cruise missile breached the outer surveillance ring. It was flying at an altitude of barely 60 meters, using a jet turbine engine to push itself to a speed of 500 knots. It had navigated through the shallow coastal canyons, staying entirely below the radar horizon until it reached the flat expanse of the desert floor. It was a massive weapon, carrying a 500-kilogram, high-explosive penetrating warhead, and its flight path was locked directly onto the Central Command bunker where Miller and his staff were currently standing. "New hostile contact, bearing 040, the radar operator shouted, his voice tight. "Profile is a low-altitude cruise missile. Range is 8 miles and closing extremely fast. Time to impact is 50 seconds. Outside on the northern defensive berm, the heavy diesel generators of the Patriot missile batteries screamed back up to maximum output. The engagement control station, now free from the blinding interference of the falling titanium, acquired a flawless, unbroken track on the incoming cruise missile. The fire control officers did not hesitate. The intercept geometry was perfect. They authorized the launch sequence immediately. 2 Patriot interceptors blasted out of their reinforced launch canisters in rapid succession. The heavy solid rocket boosters ignited with a concussive roar, throwing massive clouds of scorched sand outward as the missiles pitched over sharply, diving directly into the thick dust layer to meet the low-flying threat. 5 miles outside the perimeter wire, the 2 interceptors slammed into the side of the heavy cruise missile. The sheer kinetic energy of the collision vaporized the weapon instantly, creating a spectacular explosion that illuminated the heavy atmospheric particulate for miles in every direction. The shockwave rolled over the desert floor, rattling the reinforced concrete blast walls of the airbase one final time. Miller watched the master tactical display. The bright red threat icon blinked twice, fragmented into 3 smaller pieces of harmless debris, and then faded completely from the screen. The radar operators scanned the airspace continuously for another 90 seconds. The screen remained clear. Intercept confirmed. The damage control officer reported quietly. "The airspace is clear. We have no further inbound tracks." 5:15 in the morning. The sky over the United Arab Emirates finally began to lighten, though the severe atmospheric dust inversion layer turned the rising sun into a dull, bruised orange smear across the horizon. The heat was already building, pressing the thick particulate matter down over the reinforced concrete bunkers of Al Dhafra Air Base. The immediate tactical engagement was officially over. By the strict metrics of the Central Command operating procedures, the United States military had successfully defended the primary installation. The ANSPY-6 phased array radars on the northern berm had tracked the heavy threats. The Patriot missile batteries had successfully intercepted 3 medium-range ballistic warheads in the upper atmosphere and destroyed 1 heavy land attack cruise missile just miles from the perimeter wire. The ground security forces had shredded the final attack drone 50 meters short of the aviation fuel depot. 3,000 personnel were stepping out of their heavily fortified shelters, breathing the acrid, chalky air, alive and unhurt. The Central Command Center remained fully operational, but the absolute supremacy of the American defensive posture had been fundamentally shattered. On the southern perimeter, the smoking crater where the primary surveillance array had stood was a stark, burning monument to the fragility of the base. The 50-meter steel tower was completely gone. reduced to a twisted, melted heap of blackened struts, resting heavily on top of the crushed generator block. Staff Sergeant Michael Reynolds, along with 2 junior maintenance engineers, were dead. Their bodies were still trapped beneath 400 tons of shattered masonry and warped steel, waiting for the heavy recovery equipment to arrive from the main engineering depot. Airman First Class Thomas Harris was lying in the base medical facility with a severe traumatic brain injury and 2 completely ruptured eardrums. The physical cost of standing a perimeter watch against a threat they were never supposed to face. Captain James Miller walked slowly out of the Tactical Operations Center and stood on the concrete walkway overlooking the sprawling flight line. The heavy diesel generators of the Patriot batteries were idling down, emitting a low, exhausted rumble. The distinct smell of pulverized desert rock, scorched aviation fuel, and burnt composite material hung trapped beneath the heavy weather system, a scent that would take weeks to finally blow away. The Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment, the document that had confidently labeled the Iranian coastline as dormant and stripped of munitions just hours ago, was worse than wrong. It represented a catastrophic failure of imagination. The adversary had not just fired blindly into the dark. They had executed a brilliantly synchronized, multi-domain strike designed specifically to exploit the American defensive cycle. They had used the heavy ballistic weapons to force the base to reveal its primary emitters and saturate the airspace with blinding titanium debris. They had used the signature dust inversion layer as a natural stealth coating. They had weaponized the environment to slip cheap, slow-moving propeller drones through a billion-dollar defensive net, trading a $20,000 piece of fiberglass for a $40 million sensor array and 3 American lives. Miller watched the ground crews slowly towing the 2 FA-18 fighters back into their hardened concrete shelters. The highly advanced interceptors had flown their mission, but the weather and the terrain masking tactics of the enemy had rendered them functionally blind. The base had survived the night, but the tactical victory felt profoundly hollow. The defense had required everything they had, stretching the crews and the computer algorithms to their absolute physical and processing limits. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the thousands of pieces of jagged metal shrapnel scattered across the desert floor outside the wire. The objective of keeping the base functioning had been achieved, but as Miller looked out toward the northern horizon, the true weight of the engagement settled over him. If a supposedly dormant coastal sector could generate a synchronized strike complex enough to permanently blind a portion of the base and reach the inner flight line, what would happen when the adversary decided to launch a full-scale, dedicated saturation attack? The airspace over the Persian Gulf was no longer safe, and as the morning heat baked the damaged concrete, no one on the command staff had an answer for what would happen the next time the early warning network went silent.